Hi, everyone. A few months ago, I had an opportunity to sit down with General Hugh Shelton and have a conversation about leadership. As many of you know, he was on Red Hat's board of directors for 14 years and chairman for much of that. General Shelton is well regarded internationally as a great leader. I can speak personally to say he's one of the most extraordinary leaders I've had an opportunity to meet in my life. We had an opportunity to have a great conversation, and I'm so excited that we're able to share some of those insights with you here today. On the subject of leadership, how would you define leadership?
You know, I guess there are 10,000 books written on leadership, and all of them have a different definition. Mine is pretty simple. It's one's ability to influence others. It may be by title, it may be by position, or it may be from just the traits that you display, the attributes that you have that you've developed over time. We have good leaders and bad leaders. Good leaders, I think, are those who have attributes that are based solidly on integrity, and it builds from there. Professional and personal ethics, service to the organization or to the country or whoever it happens that they're leading. But that's a good leader. And then, of course, you have bad leaders that show other traits that we all say we never want to do that, and so that becomes part of the box that good leaders say, I got to put that up in this box and make sure that I'm never guilty of doing this particular thing. As a leader, we can be leading one person or we can be leading 3.2 million, which happens to be the number of people in the armed forces at the time I was chairman. But the same attributes and traits apply regardless of the level that you're serving in.
I've always used the term that the worst way to lead is to have people follow you because they have to, right? You want people to follow you because they want to. And certainly, as you've talked about character-based leadership and what you've been able to accomplish in the armed forces, you're able to do that. But when you think about how do you actually go about doing that, especially in such a hierarchical place like the military, people will follow you because they have to, but you were able to kind of create a context broadly, not just with your direct reports, but broadly across 3.2 million people, that they followed you because they wanted to.
I think the key thing for developing a style that makes people follow because they want to is creating an organizational climate or a culture that lets people know that you really and sincerely care about them as individuals, you care about their families, you want to hear what they've got to say. You take their concerns into consideration before you make decisions. I think people do want to be listened to. They do want leaders who sincerely care about their interests, about their families, and when they sense that leaders care about that, they care about what they're saying, then they start saying, that's an individual I want to be with. Or, as put another way, that's an individual that I'd follow to Hades. You know, that's the kind of person that will lead me in the right direction.
Growing up in a small town, who did you look up to and why?
I was very fortunate as a youngster looking back at it. I was raised in a rural community. My mother was a school teacher. My father was a farmer. And so the centerpiece of the community I grew up in was the school and the church. I got a healthy dose of character building at home from my parents. The church reinforced the principles that they were espousing, and then of course the school did the same thing. I started to learn a little bit about leadership and, for example, public speaking, because my mother, as a school teacher, thrust me into the school play. Even today I get flashbacks and I cringe when I hear the song "Oh Holy Night," because it gets to a pretty high level, but I was forced to sing that as a solo in the school play. So that was great character building and a lot of lessons learned. And this whole community was a community of former veterans from World War II. And so those were the people that I looked up to. They were solid as a rock, and I started to develop my values from them.
So why did you decide you wanted to go to NC State?
Well, one thing that I learned on the farm is that hard work will not kill you. But my mother was intent that I would go on to college. I was raised in an NC State family. There were no Carolina, Duke, not to mention MIT or Harvard, are graduates in the family, and so I was intent to go. I did not want to major in agriculture because I had decided I wanted to get away from the farm, and so I elected to major in textiles.
What motivated you to, I guess, originally do ROTC, then decide to actually make the military a career?
When I went to NC State, I found out that I would have to take 2 years of ROTC. I found amazingly that I liked it. If you took the last 2 years, you would have a 2-year commitment to serve on active duty, but the great news was they would pay you $27 a month to stay in the ROTC for the advanced phase. $27 a month to a farm boy back in 1961, 62 timeframe, that was big money. And so I jumped at it and said, I'll take the 2 years and I'll do the 2 years of active duty. But I never intended to stay in the military. Instead, I went through the interview process at NC State and elected to sign up with an outfit called Regal Textile, which had the largest mill in the United States. You brought cotton bales to the back of it and finished material went out the other end. And as a matter of fact, a lot of it was camouflaged cloth by the time I left that was starting to make the battle dress uniforms for those that were deployed to Vietnam. What I'd learned in the Army had well prepared me for the training program that they threw me into at Regal.
Interesting. And so what brought you then back to the military?
After working at Regal Textile for about 3 months or 4 months, I was getting letters from all of my buddies, my lieutenant friends who had now deployed out of Fort Benning to Vietnam, and I really felt a little bit guilty. And so I went home after 6 months and told Carolyn, I said, you know, I enjoy what I'm doing at Regal. I'm doing really well. I said, but I enjoyed what I was doing in the Army more. I enjoyed the camaraderie. I enjoyed leading troops. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to go back in the military. I didn't say to make it a career, as she reminds me quite frequently. She said, okay, if that's what you really want to do. I said, well, I need to tell you, if I do it, they'll send me straight to Vietnam. And she said, whatever you want to do, I'll be with you. And so I elected to go back in, and the rest is history. Once I got there, I loved what I was doing. I did go to special ops training, and from there, decided to make it a career.
I think there's a really interesting lesson in there about do what you love, because A, you'll be good at it and it shows through and you're passionate about it. That's one of the pieces of advice that I always give is do what you're passionate about and you love to do. Worry less about, is this the exact right career move? Is this the right type of company? You'll be successful if you do what you love to do.
That's great advice, and I think you're 100% right. George Steinbrenner, later on when I was a 4-star, down in Tampa, where the Yankees were having their spring training, and I went over to visit. George Steinbrenner asked me, said, General, if you don't mind, how much do you make? And I thought very quickly, I had never really thought about what it meant. I said, about $125,000 a year. And he said, $125,000 a month? Somebody ought to be fired. I said, no, George, I said a year. And he jumped up. He said, a year? That's criminal. Somebody ought to go to jail for that. You need to be paid. Of course, he's thinking about Alex and the others that played for him, you know, and how much money he was paying them per month. And but he was quite irate. I said, George, we're not in it for the money. Trust me. If the military was in it for the money, we'd be bankrupt. We'd be bankrupt tomorrow. We couldn't afford to pay some of these guys what they do for us on a day-to-day basis. But that's really not what motivated the military. And so although George was upset about it, he wasn't the one making the decision, so we kept getting paid the same thing.
Too bad.
Yeah.
Now, it really does illustrate the power of a mission-driven organization.
It does.
Who you can attract and retain,
Exactly.
but then how hard they're also willing to work.
Exactly.
And of course, it's incumbent upon the leaders then to make sure that you're reinforcing every day the mission and why you're doing it.
Exactly.
So you, for the first time, really became a leader of your own troops in Vietnam. You were 25 years old. What was that like? Obviously in a very high-stakes situation.
Well, I found myself as a 25-year-old, very junior captain, being in charge of a Special Forces A team, or A detachment as they call it, which really was myself and 2 other lieutenants, very junior officers. And then the rest of the team being very senior non-commissioned officers, very talented individuals, but they were a lot senior to me. They were about as old as my father was in some cases. What I learned from that was the power of preparation, because the Army had trained me really well. They had sent me to all the right courses, courses that these NCOs recognized as ones that would separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Ones that would prepare you for what the Army would ask you to do. And so they really respected you for who you were. Now, in a short period of time, they sized you up, and they either liked what they saw and you did very well, or they could very quickly undermine an officer that was there who was not competent. And so I was fortunate that I'd been properly prepared for the job. So I think one of the real lessons I took away from that is how important preparation is for people that we are going to place in leadership positions. Because without that preparation, then we as a corporation or we as a large unit share in the failure of those people because they weren't properly prepared for what we asked them to do.
Well, speaking of preparation, one of my favorite stories in the book is about you're trained not to have your rifle slung over your shoulder.
I was moving through the jungle with a small team, and we were moving along the far reaches of Vietnam out near the Laotian border. And we had just moved through a large deserted base camp. The cooking fires were still smoking. It was a scene that sent a chill down your spine when you thought, what size unit has just been here? And as we had moved on up the trail, I had removed my weapon not only from the position of being under my shoulder, and I had removed the safety, and I had my trigger finger alongside the trigger guard right next to the trigger. As we rounded a bend, all of a sudden there in front of me is a guy who's facing us head on. He's at sling arms, has that weapon up here. And he reached to pull that weapon down, and all I had to do was move my finger. And it turned out it was a Docker, which I regretted. In his rucksack was a book that looked about like this, and when you opened it up, there were intricate drawings in there that he had done by hand when he was in medical school, apparently. It was all of his notes and everything. It was, I sent it back as part of to our documents analyst people. But in retrospect, I wish I'd kept it and put it in a museum because it was quite a record of what this individual had done. And but he was slow on the draw, and consequently, it didn't do him any good after that. But the lesson I learned again was be prepared and do as you're trained to do, not as maybe you'd like to do. It was a lot more comfortable to carry that weapon up on your shoulder than it was under your arm. But you were always ready when it was there.
I mean, that's a visceral, obviously, life and death situation, but I love that story. I mean, every day, the mundane things we do, I often say it's like eating your spinach, the making sure we're doing the performance reviews that we need to do for people, that we're having the right succession conversations, because you never know when a time's going to come up when that preparation is going to be the difference between winning a deal or successfully beating a competitor in the things that we're doing. And so you never know when that moment's going to come, and so you got to make sure that you're doing those all along the way. And to me, that's just such a great, obviously much higher stakes story around always making sure you're doing that.
Same principles. It's a kind of ironic that when they were getting ready to do a statue of me down at Fort Bragg, the architect of the statue had me in a position where my rifle was slung over my shoulder. And I said, I can't live with that, because all those non-commissioned officers that served, not only with me, but with all the other captains in Vietnam, would say, look at that, that just shows you how incompetent that guy was. But, I don't think there's anything more important in leading than being prepared for the next job that you may face or may be rewarded with. And I've found that to be true from the time that I was a lieutenant. I remember very well being a young lieutenant there with another lieutenant by the name of Watson. And the old battalion executive officer came up and said, what are your aspirations? And Lieutenant Watson says, I want to be a general. That's my goal. And he looked at me and Shelton and said, what about you? And I said, I hope to make first lieutenant, which would have been the next promotion up. And the irony of it is I ended up being the general, and Watson never made first lieutenant. But I think preparation, I never concentrated on getting promoted, but I did say, if I ever have to fill the shoes of that captain, what should I do in order to be prepared to do that? And then I would seek those types of opportunities. For example, I went to Ranger School because I saw that company commander was a Ranger, and I liked his style, and I thought that would help me be a better company commander should I ever be selected to be a company commander. Preparation of the advanced course, which is the 9-month-long course that they send you to be a captain or a company commander. I took that by correspondence. I did it at night just to make sure that in case I didn't get a chance to go to it, and as it worked out, I didn't before I found myself as a company commander, that I at least would have gotten the poor man's version, so to speak, the correspondence course. So I think preparation is extremely important. And each of us individually bear part of that burden. We shouldn't just count on our headquarters taking care of it. We should seek those types of opportunities. I know Red Hat has a great school system. They have great courses that people can go to or attend, and those are the types of things that prepare people to be better leaders.
Thank you. You mentioned an important point, especially at Red Hat, given just the nature of the organization, is be proactive, try to understand areas where you can use development and proactively go seek it out. Don't just assume that your boss is going to bring it to you or the system will take care of it. You're a key part of that. You talk about yourself being a straight talker and seem to have affinity for leaders who are straight talkers. What do you mean by that, and why do you think that straight talkers make good leaders?
Well, when I said straight talker, what I was really referring to is someone that is willing to tell the boss the way it is or the way they think it is, to make a recommendation that they know right up front may not be exactly what they think the boss wants to do. One of the things that I never liked was being surrounded by yes men. I like people to tell me the way it is or the way they think it is. Tell the emperor he has no clothes on. Let him figure out how he's going to correct it. But I don't like people that are always trying to tell me what they think I want to hear, because I don't think you get good advice when that happens.
Yeah, I've heard you use the term speak truth to power. I think that's a great way to articulate that, and I think I agree, it's so valuable. If you hear only kind of an echo of your own opinion, then you really are alone in making decisions, and that's a bad place to be.
Sure is.
You tell a great story in your book about making a recommendation to a superior officer, and then have another officer in private tell you, next time run your ideas by me first. That recommendation should have come from me. This is related a little bit to truth to power.
I was a young captain on my second tour in Vietnam now. I had at that point, about 2 years in grade as a captain. I was in a battalion, an airborne battalion. We had a lieutenant colonel as a commander. My boss was excited. We came back one day from a meeting with the division commander and said they were going to do a cordon and search operation. And they wanted us to pick our slice of the pie. Now, a cordon and search operation is one in which you basically draw a big circle on the map, and these battalions would occupy the outer perimeter. And on a given date and time or whenever, you would crunch the circle and drive the enemy toward the middle, which you would pound then with artillery or with naval gunfire, and the infantry would take out the rest. So the boss said he gave us our slice of that pie. S2 intelligence, I want you to tell me which slice we should take. And so I went back and called for my trusty intelligence sergeant. So that night we worked all night long. We developed an acetate folder. We didn't have computers, so it was an acetate folder that you would hang on the map. And we had about 5 of those. We showed enemy contacts on one, all the contacts made by American forces in that area over the last 3 years. radio intercept reports where we had intercepted radio reports, and the list went on and on. But there were 5 major overlays. And so the next morning after the morning briefing, the colonel said, okay, all the staff stay behind. I want to hear from the S2 about which area we should select. So I stood up to brief, and before I could brief, the S3 jumped up and said, Colonel, I can tell you right now, we don't need a briefing. It's this area right here. He said, I studied the map last night, and that's where the trails are, that's where the water is, that's where the enemy will be. The colonel said, I hear you, Ken, sit down. I asked the S2. So I stood up, I laid my overlays up one at a time, and as I laid them up, one particular area started being clouded out by all the contacts and all the intercepts and everything in this one area. And it was on the opposite side from the S3's recommendation. So the S3 jumps up again and he said, I hear what the S2's saying, but I'm telling you, Colonel, here's where we want to go. And the colonel got pretty ugly and said, sit down, Ken. I didn't ask you, I asked the captain. And so I recommended that we go to that slice. Well, that night after the evening briefing, I walked outside the bunker that served as our tactical operations center. And I stood there with one of my friends, another captain, and we were talking, and suddenly out of the dark, this figure emerges, and it's the S3, the major. And he said, Captain Shelton, I told you before, you work your stuff through me, you don't go directly to the colonel. You should have followed my lead and recommended the area. That's where the enemy is going to be. And I said, well, thank you very much, Major, but I happen to be a principal staff officer. I'm a direct report also. The colonel asked me for my opinion. I gave it to him. You gave your opinion. He selected mine. I'm sorry about that, but my goal is to do what's right, not to follow other crazy ideas, as it turns out. And he stumbled off into the dark.
I think what's interesting about that story is not only what you did, but the fact that the colonel also, in the way he ran and structured the meeting, was very clear that he wanted to hear from you as well as others, right? So he also kind of created the context which allowed you to feel comfortable doing it, but also gave you the voice to do it and told, you know, the major, sit down, I've asked here. And I think that's important both ways, is people being willing to stand up and where they've done work and be ready to give their opinion, and then also the kind of the leader in that case being willing to say, I need to hear from everyone. And so when that balance is right, it's when you can get incredible results. So what role does listening play in leadership? And how about being open to others' perspectives and ideas?
You know, of all the attributes that good leaders have, I think listening is probably one of the most important. When I talk about what it was like to work for 2 different presidents, Bush and Clinton, one of the things they shared in common was the ability to listen. When you were talking to them, they would listen to you, and I mean, it was intently. There was not another person in the room. They concentrated on what you were saying. I think we as leaders need to be able to do the same thing, and we also need to be able to reach out and let people know that we want to hear what they've got to say. We want them to let us know what their ideas are. We want to know what the irritants are, if there are irritants that keep them from doing their job properly or keep our organization from being a great place to work. And so I think people respect a leader that they know genuinely cares about them, and they get part of that sensing from when we're willing to listen to them. We may not always agree with them. We may not always be able to implement what they want us to do, but at least they know they've been heard. And I think that's one of the key attributes that good leaders have.
No, agreed. And just to build on that a little bit, in a world of email and all these other vehicles, I've continued to struggle with, but I think it's important to do, is to even respond to that. Because I've found a number of people, especially my former employer, we're better at it at Red Hat, will say, hey, I emailed the boss, I never heard back. And that to me is one of the worst things you can do. I always say, that's obviously not a direct conversation, but that's the same thing like asking you your opinion and then looking at my watch, right?
Exactly.
That's like so irritating. And when you say you want to hear that, and so recognizing that's not just face to face, but when people have opinions or points of view, making sure even if you say I disagree, that's okay too, but at least you listen, you heard, and you responded.
Exactly.
Right. You said that sometimes you can be nice, other times you have to be ruthless. Why is that?
I think it all depends on who we're leading. I had certainly, as I described earlier, I encountered some situations where I was working with some people that really did not want to be all they could be, so to speak. And when that happens, you've got just to do what's right. And it may be viewed by others as being ruthless. In my case, I'd call it just making sure that we keep the bar at a very high standard, and the organization will understand that you believe in people abiding by the rules, abiding by the regulations, and leading a life that basically means that they are good people in addition to being good leaders or good people, followers in some cases.
There's a certain set of things where you can say there's zero tolerance for this. You know what? There's certain areas where people can make mistakes. They try things, didn't work out. We all have frailties and none of us are perfect. But really there's a set of primarily character-based attributes where if you violate those, zero tolerance. And I think some of your stories, display that so well.
In other cases where I was involved in organizations, and I'll use one at Fort Bragg, North Carolina as an example, I inherited an organization that had 3 battalion commanders, that's 650-man units, there were 3 of them, in a brigade, 1st Brigade, Aegis Second Airborne, where these 3 guys were absolutely superb. I equated myself to being a stagecoach driver. I sit up on the stagecoach. These horses out in front of me, these 3 battalion commanders, are running full blast. You don't have to flog them. You don't have to beat on them. All you've got to do is gently tug the reins left or right, depending on which way you want to go. And every now and then maybe pull back a little bit to slow them down. But you never have to get out the coach whip. You never have to do anything. You don't have to holler at them. Just you're the driver. So there you can be very gentle. You can be the nice guy. Which I tried to be, and I always wanted to be, but whenever you have to use a little bit harder tactics, so to speak, you have to be a leader that's willing to do that. Other times, I think you can just tell people what you want done, what the standard is, and they will perform to that standard, and that's where I found myself at Fort Bragg.
Well, I think that's just a great illustration. An effective leader has to be effective at managing different types of people in different situations and kind of recognizing that. And you may have a comfortable style, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to manage on the edges or in different situations.
As you said, you have to know who you're leading. And as the example I use, if you're leading a group of people like myself, first of all, they should have already retired. But if they haven't, remember, they're the silent generation. And so you might be able to get more performance out of them by offering a cash bonus. But if you're working with a group of millennials, understand that they may value their time off more than they would the bonus. And so knowing who you're leading is extremely important in terms of the style of leadership and the way in which you lead the organization.
So you tell a great story in your book about talking your group from last to first in Reenlistment. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? And if you could, because the thing I find most powerful about that story is the way you attack morale, not by saying, let me be softer, but actually by being tougher. All right, and it's to some extent, I love that story because it talks a lot about, okay, morale is not something you can bake cookies and make people happy for 10 minutes, but really creating a context, an organization where people feel both valued but feel like they can accomplish things ultimately is what leads to morale. So I think it's a great story overall.
It all started when I took command of a battalion out on the West Coast at Fort Lewis, Washington. When I went into the division commander, he said, re-enlistment is the lowest in the division. People don't want to stay, they want to leave. The following morning, I went out for a run. About halfway through it, I noticed that the NCOs that were calling cadence as you ran were using anti-Army cadences. It was things like, heck no, we won't go. By the time we got back to the battalion, I had smoke coming out of my ears. I called for all 5 of my company commanders, and I said, I want every one of you to go back and get the NCOs that were calling cadence this morning, who were derogatory. I want them barred from re-enlistment in the Army. By that night, I had, I think it was 19 NCOs that had been barred from re-enlisting, some of them with 15 years of service. And Sergeant Major, I want you to get with the re-enlistment NCO. I want a breakfast set up to recognize the good troops that are leaving this battalion. And company commanders, I want you to recommend who goes to this breakfast. And the only ones that go are the ones that you really would love to have had stay. Have a certificate drawn up. And I want it to be a recognition of appreciation for these guys' service in the 360 Go Devil Battalion. About I guess 2 or 3 weeks after that, one morning my non-commissioned officer comes running over and says, we've had an unbelievable thing to happen. I thought he was going to tell me something blew up or whatever, but he said, I had 7 guys lined up at the door when I came to work this morning to re-enlist. So by, I think, the end of the first month, we had moved from number 26 to number 15 in the division. But the following month, we were number 1 in the division in re-enlistment. We stayed number 1 for the rest of my time as a commander, and it was all based on get rid of the people that are the laggards, to get rid of the people that aren't performing, recognize good people and the jobs that they're doing.
That's such a great story. I do think there's something to, an academic would say, call it procedural justice, where you say people want to feel like they're part of something where people doing a good job are rewarded and people who are not are dealt with. And
Exactly.
So when that doesn't happen and people don't feel like there's procedural justice, the whole organization is kind of pulled down.
Sure does.
And that really is something for the leader to drive.
It is.
You speak a lot about leading from the front as your motto. Why is that your motto?
I think as leaders it's extremely important that we have a mentality of we lead from the front. I equate it to a noodle. If you want to take a wet noodle and you put it out on the table and you want the noodle to go from my left to my right, you go to the left and you pull it forward, you move to the left. If you go to the rear and try to push it, the noodle doesn't go anywhere. And so leaders are out front. They set the example both by their actions as well as by their deeds. As a 4-star, even when I assumed command of our Special Operations Forces, the Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, the Air Force Special Ops airplanes, I still believed in leading from the front. And so I went out to the high altitude school. I went through the high altitude low opening Halo school. I went out then on operations with the SEALs and with the Green Berets, and jumped from 24,000 feet with an 80-pound rucksack in the dead of night, because that's what they had to do. That's what I would ask them to do. And I wanted them to know that the guy asking them to do it knew what it was going to be like, knew what the experience was like. And I think unless we as leaders are willing to experience the same things that those we're asking to carry out difficult operations or tough operations know what they're asking of us, then they're less likely to feel comfortable with the leader.
You often speak about the importance of a leader taking care of people and not forgetting where they came from. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think that a values-based leader, someone who really wants to leave a legacy as being a great leader, perhaps more importantly, as a great person, is one that fully recognizes that the wind beneath the wings of any organization are the people. As Lee Iacocca, the former chairman of Daimler Chrysler, used to say, anyone who doesn't get along with people around here has the kiss of death, because that's all we are, is people. And I think most organizations are that way. Certainly in the military, We've got great technology, whether it's airplanes, tanks, or whatever. It's really good, but that's not what wins. It's the people. And it's, I think that as leaders, we have to understand that we have to first of all understand what motivates our people, but secondly, we've got to make sure that we are incentivizing them in ways that will make them want to be all that they can be, and recognize that they are what makes it happen. And we treat them by the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If we understand that they want to be treated the same way we want to be treated, that goes an awfully long ways in terms of people wanting to be a part of our organization and liking the organizational culture in which they're working.
The phrase "be all you can be," we always know because it's a tagline, but I've heard you use that before. And this idea is part of being a leader. Obviously, there are people who have jobs to do and accomplishments as a broad organization, but recognize if you can help people feel like they're fulfilling their full potential and developing, professionally and personally, that impact you can have on people's lives and therefore what they're willing to do is just extraordinary.
Exactly. It allows them to what the academicians call self-actualizing, at the same time that we're providing an opportunity for them to be a part of a bigger thing in life and be a part of a team getting a job done.
Reflecting back, what changed most about your leadership style as you became a more experienced leader?
I think if I could pinpoint one thing that had to change, it was my ability to delegate. One of the key things that they teach you in Ranger School, and granted it's a small unit focus, but they teach you that if you don't delegate responsibilities, and you get to a river at night and each person in that team has things they have to do. There's the rope man that has to swim the rope across. There are the lifeguards that have to go out on each side. There are the security that you have to, everyone has a job, and it's cold and it's raining and you're wet. But if you haven't delegated properly, you're going to fail. And I heard them and I said, yeah, I've got to do this to get through the Ranger course. But as I went along in my career, as I became a company commander, I could still manage everything myself. And I had an old saying, if you want it done well, you do it yourself. And I tried to do that. And then when I became a battalion commander, where I had 5 companies of 150 men each, and my battalion of about overall 700, I couldn't do it all. It was just impossible. And I was either going to kill myself trying, or I was going to have to really delegate. And so I did. And I learned that I could trust people. I still had to check to make sure the job got done and got done to the proper standard, not micromanage them. I didn't tell them how to do it. I just told them what needed to be done and the standard to which we wanted to accomplish it, and they got it done. And I was amazed at how few times that it did not get done to standard. And so I started to feel more and more comfortable about my ability to delegate. And that was, by that time, I had almost 14 years in the military, or 13 years.
I think that's a really important one, is that delegation actually requires that you have a good sense of confidence in yourself and you're confident enough to say, I can let them do that, and then I may verify afterwards, but it's okay. And actually the best thing in the world is when you delegate and someone does a better job than you could have done it yourself.
Exactly.
And that's, I think, for people who are less confident, that can seem intimidating, but I would actually argue for a great leader, that's phenomenal, right?
Yeah, and particularly if it's someone that you've been coaching, teaching, or mentoring, and you're looking at them as being one of those stars that's going to rise up in the organization, and you say, that's proof positive that I'm putting my effort into the right person or persons.
Well, one thing that I often tell people is if you want to get promoted, you better have built a couple of successors, or it's almost impossible to promote you, right? And so people have to recognize that's a key part of what they need to do.
I always felt like when I left an organization that I was hopefully leaving a better organization than I inherited. And from a couple of examples I've used, you can see I didn't have too far to go to make that come true. But I wanted to make sure that when I walked out of there, if I got hit by a bullet or hit by a bus, that the organization would continue to function, hopefully at the same level or better than when I was leading it.
I think that's a really important attribute, because I do think there are people out there who, because of ego or whatever, say, I'm so important to this organization, where in the end, ultimately, as one of the famous coaches said, the graveyard's full of indispensable people. So, I mean, ultimately, our roles are to build a set of successors that are hopefully better than we are.
Exactly.
Right?
And if you check closely at that graveyard, you'll find a lot of them were military guys.
Indeed, indeed. So if you could give any one piece of advice to a potential leader watching this, what would you say?
I guess that I would say I think we all, as we strive to be known as a great leader, should inherently be concerned about making sure, number one, that we take care of our people, that we recognize that they're the ones that really get the job done day to day, that we build ourselves on a base of integrity, that's the attribute in our character for which we are best known, and that in the end, people say not only was he or she a great leader, but they were also a great person. So we are better known for the type of person we were than the leader that we were.
A friend of mine who's CEO of a similar sized company to Red Hat says, when you're a CEO, you're like never alone, but you're always lonely, in the sense that you're having to make a lot of decisions. Ultimately, you're in charge of making that decision. And I don't see how, or maybe I don't have the capability to do that without feeling like I have a set of core principles I use as a criteria to make those. And really that's principles about person. That's not strategic this or that. There's a certain set of principles that are right, that are kind of a true north that can guide you. And I don't see how you could possibly be a good leader and feel confident in decisions if you don't have that kind of centering, which is all about character.
I agree 100%. The old saying in Washington is, if you want a friend, get a dog. And I can honestly say that for the about 7 years that I spent up in Washington, the only friend I had in most of those jobs was Carolyn. And then my core set of principles and upon which I based the decisions that I made. And fortunately, they never fail me.
Well, and my view on that is, for some reason, if it's truly your core principles and they fail, then you can sleep well at night, so be it.
Exactly. I did what I thought was the right thing to do.
Right. I'd rather be able to sleep at night.
Exactly. Interesting story. Down at Fort Bragg, they had 2 golf courses. One was open to non-commissioned officers and troops and the public, and the other one was the Officers Club golf course. For years, the Officers Club golf course had been losing money. The other one was making money. But they had always held on to the Officers Club because the commander had always been told, it's right there in the officer housing area, it's right next to the Officers Club. You're going to tee off a lot of people if you change that and make it open to anybody else. And I had looked at it and I thought, this is dumb. We're losing money. We got lines forming up to play golf at the other course. And so I decided I would change it. Well, my deputy commanding general, the 2-star, and my chief of staff both came to me and said, you don't want to do this, boss. It's the wrong decision. You'll regret this as long as you live. All the other corps commanders are going to be down on you, et cetera, et cetera. I listened to them and I said, I'm going ahead with it. Well, they came back to see me the next day, trying to convince me otherwise. I went home that night and I said, tomorrow's decision day. I've got to tell them which way I'm going. So I went into work and I said, okay, here's my decision. We're opening up that golf course. It's the right thing to do for all the right reasons. And they both said, boss, we were coming to you this morning to tell you we agree with you. It is the right thing to do. We opened it up, never had a problem. Now both golf courses are filled to capacity and making money. And it was the right thing to do for the right reasons.
And those you do, you sleep well at night knowing you do it on a set of principles.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you so much. This has been incredibly valuable to me and for Red Hat. I hope you found this conversation as valuable as I did. Leadership is hard. There's no manual. There's no rule book. There aren't necessarily right and wrong answers. And so the best you can do is build your own inner sense of capability and look for role models and learn from others. I've certainly found General Shelton to be one of the best possible role models, and it's really been truly a pleasure to work with them. And I hope this conversation gives you a bit of a window into what truly great leadership looks like.